Thank you. Thank you. Yes, let's sage the place. All right. Welcome to the final episode before the season finale of Dr. G at the Heart of Healthcare. This is episode 34, and it's about meeting the grave woman in Seattle. Welcoming Joelle Simone Maldonado to the show. Hello.
Hi, Dr. G. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so happy that I got to meet you, South Carolina lady. So let me tell the audience just how we met real quick, and then just let you do a brief bio. If you all follow me on social media, you know that I was recently one of the panelists at the Death Super Conference in Seattle. It was hosted by a few organizations, the National Home Funeral Association, the let me get it all right, the National End of Life Doula Alliance, where Ashley is the president. She was on the podcast earlier this season. The National, no, I'm sorry, the Funeral Consumers Alliance and the People's Memorial Association. And it was called the Death Super Conference. I was in and out of Seattle. I was on the fourth panel. You were on the third panel. And it was so good to meet you in person because I've been following you on Instagram.
I appreciate that. And I want to say, Dr. G, you did such a tremendous job on your panel. I remember distinctly meeting you prior to the conference starting. I was really nervous, and there was something about your energy that was just so calming and relaxing and welcoming. And I didn't know what to expect. And when you got on that stage, you are a phenomenal speaker. Like, you're a powerhouse. I almost didn't expect that big energy to come out of your small being, but I'm so glad I got to witness that. It was like a light came on, and just, I was watching you. You did a phenomenal job. So thank you for that.
Oh my gosh, you were so sweet.
Meeting you.
Oh my gosh, you're so sweet. Thank you. It was a privilege to be there, and I learned so much. So let me tell the audience real quick before we get into your bio what the panel was, because we're going to talk about your journey to being the grave woman, which is phenomenal. And it's so important, everyone, for us to, like this conference did, build bridges from healthcare to the funeral industry. Everyone knows I'm a hospice physician, so we're often, we do the final arrangements. We make sure they're in place for the families, but never really talked about that. And so we're doing that. But let me share about the panel. So the panel, it was one day. So the first panel talked about the legal issues. The second one talked about affordability. The one that the grave woman was on was diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then I was on the models of care to talk about Mourning mobile concierge and how that fills in gaps of care. So bravo to everyone who put that on. I heard it was the first conference, but it was so well done.
Shout out to
you want to yeah, thank you. So you have anything that stands out to you from that day, or when you shared on the panel? Maybe you could give everyone a synopsis of what you shared that day.
Definitely. So I, like many other public speakers, my mind kind of goes blank when I speak. So I don't remember everything I said verbatim. But the thing that stands out to me about the Super Deathcare Conference with the theme Building Bridges is I feel like that's exactly what happened. I met people from such diverse roles in death care that I didn't know existed. And in addition to that, I learned so much. And what I found out this year in traveling and attending a lot of conferences is that I really like the intimate setting that the smaller conferences have. As a person with social anxiety, it's very overwhelming to walk into a huge venue with thousands of people. But the venue, the King County Library that they hosted the event at, was not only aesthetically beautiful, but it was just like being in that auditorium. I felt held in those conversations, some of which were very difficult, especially when you're having a conversation about the lack of inclusion by people that have historically been oppressors of people of color, and speaking hard truth and saying things that almost bruise the ego, but trying to intention of building bridges and communicating truths, not necessarily for myself, but for those that I represent, which are African American people. So you asked about the things that I shared at the conference. I myself, and I'm going to kind of answer both questions at once. My
Yeah.
bio, talk about what I
Thank
talked
you.
about. I am a funeral director by trade, but by just humanity, I'm a person that really cares for others. I have the honor of doing that when people transition, caring for the deceased and their families. I started off very early in life being curious about death care because my uncle was a mortician and I was just fascinated by what he did. My uncle Mark would let me come to the funeral home with him when I visited him in Florida, and he would allow me to go into the embalming room and introduce that as a sacred space and taught me to honor and respect the sacredness of that space. He would let me hand out tissue in the back of the funeral home when people would get upset or put flowers in the hearse. And I fell in love with death care at a very young age. And so that curiosity grew into, okay, I can actually do this as a job. So I went to college, graduated, and my first job out of college was in a cemetery. I was a family service counselor. So I worked on the cemetery and ironically enough, the company I worked for, which was a corporation, sold the cemetery. And so we all got fired, which was heartbreaking for me. I felt like I lost
Hmm.
my identity.
Thumbs
But
down.
right. Yeah, I'm like, yeah, thumbs up. I got fired because it was a good thing, actually, in hindsight.
Mm.
I could have worked that job forever and not been pushed to go to mortuary school. So when I got fired, I said, you know what? I still want to do this. I'm going to go to mortuary school, talk to my family about it. I was very blessed. My grandmother paid for me to go to mortuary school. And while in mortuary school, I started a blog called The Grave Woman. And I used that blog to vent. If you all remember blog, yeah, I think that's the old Google blogging site.
Yeah.
Um, that was my blog, and I would get on and tell stories about how I was feeling on certain days or things I learned in school or ask questions about mortality, life, and spirituality. And I started to have people answer those questions and send me emails about their experiences and their questions. Um, about a month prior to graduating from mortuary school, my sister and I were going through some old things that my grandmother and mother had packed up for me to go to college. And I found a book, a scrapbook my grandmother made. And one of the first pictures in the scrapbook had a drawing that I made when I was 8 years old. And it was of myself standing in a cemetery with a microphone. And it said, I am the grave woman. And I had these bright red lips and I had on a purple suit. And so, if anybody is familiar with me online, I always wear red lipstick, and purple is a color that I'm very connected to. I wouldn't say it's my favorite color, but that to me was a form of self-fulfilling prophecy because I had named my blog The Grave Woman, having no recollection of drawing that picture. So for me, it was almost like myself speaking to myself as a child. And
Yes.
Caitlin Doty was actually the person that encouraged me to turn my blog into a YouTube page. And so I started making YouTube videos, and the rest is history, literally.
What? Okay. That's a lot to unpack here.
It
Okay. Look,
is.
and look, I have my button on from the thing Live a Great Story. That's what we're doing. Someone gave this to me at the conference.
Oh my.
And look at you. Wait a minute. A blog and a YouTube. Okay, let's unpack this child being at the funeral home. You know, I have a similar connection, like two generations of funeral goers. My grandmother and my mother was actually kind of a joke. So I've been comfortable around that. And I had the brief idea of becoming a mortician after high school, like just kind of thinking about it because I was like, oh, I wonder how that works. So I want to hear about that in a sec. Um, but could you define for the audience, you know, everyone here is probably just healthcare oriented, not necessarily death care, unless there are end of life doulas that we love. How would you summarize death care, besides what you said, you know, sacred, you know, caring for the family and the decedent? Some people shy away from that. People don't run to funerals. Um, what
Yeah,
you
you're
say?
right. So I've been thinking about that. So how would I define death care? I think death care extends beyond the funeral home. Death
Mm,
care starts for many people, for example, when they receive a diagnosis. Death care can start for someone when they're contemplating their mortality, because then they make decisions about how they want to treat their life and about how they want their bodies treated when their life ends. And
Mm.
so on a broad spectrum, I think death care is realization of mortality and making decisions about what that looks like moving forward. But from a professional standpoint, I would define death care as any care that is given physically, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually to someone who's actively transitioning, transitioned, or their loved one who is witnessing that transition and experiencing that loss. By that, that can include hospice workers, that can include palliative care workers, that can include death doulas, that extends to the removal team, the people that go out and pick up a person's body when they pass away. That extends to florists who create beautiful arrangements for caskets and for funerals. That can include someone cooking food for a repast. We
Yes.
traditionally think of death care as like an undertaker's position, someone like myself who cares for the body of the decedent to restore them or either present them back to their loved ones and community, or who sits down with the family face to face to make those arrangements. Death care also does not stop when someone's either cremated or put in the ground, in my opinion. Death care is that spiritual community, that community of friends that go and sit vigil after, someone's passed away and the service is over. Death care is that pastor or that spiritual leader that's speaking words of affirmation and comfort. Death care can be the person that checks you out at the grocery store to give you a compliment because you haven't been able to take a shower because you're grieving your loved one that much. So I think death care is so much bigger than people realize. And if we really think about it, we all have a role to play in death care if we're open, sensitive, and receptive to that role.
That is so powerful. Thank you for defining that. I want to jump into, you talking about the care for the body. See, my hospice voice is coming on now because I believe this is sacred work, taking care of patients and families. Me, a stranger walking into people's homes during this, for some people it's a huge tragedy, different levels of that. It's a privilege, and I treat it with great weightiness. I wear a white coat. Like, so some people are like, don't wear a white coat. No, this is healthcare coming to your house. We're still taking care of you. You have not been abandoned. I'm
Right.
here. And so I want to know for you, just kind of unpack for us how that is. I've been in an autopsy when I was a pre-med. I wanted to shadow everybody. So I shadowed pathologists and I witnessed an autopsy. And it was
Mhm.
like, oh my gosh. And obviously during medical school, we have gross anatomy and we have the privilege of dissecting individuals who have donated their bodies to the,
Mhm.
institutions. So just let us have a peek into that experience for you. What was your first one, or tell us about it?
So the first embalming that I can remember, again, I used to go to the funeral home with my uncle a lot when I was a little girl. And so the first embalming that I remember was of a gentleman who had fallen from a ladder and hit his head on the ground. And he didn't die immediately. He ended up forming a blood clot, and that blood clot caused an aneurysm. And so they knew his death was connected to the fall. They just didn't know how. And he was on the job. So I think there was like some type of liability to his employer. So he had to have an autopsy. And so I remember being probably 8 or 9 years old and walking to the funeral home and realizing this man's head was gone. That was the way my mind conceptualized it. And I remember my uncle trying to prep me before we went in. He's like, are you sure you want to go see this? Are you sure? And I'm like, yes, take me, Uncle Bart, take me. And he's like, okay, you're going to see some things that I really don't know how to explain to you and make you understand, but I need you to know that what we're going to do when we get here is important. You need to be respectful. Okay. So I share that to say that it's always a sacred experience for me and a reverent experience for me. Fast forwarding to being in mortuary school, and our first cadaver that we received in the anatomical lab was a woman who passed away in a motorcycle accident. And it was honestly mind boggling for me. We received our cadavers from the medical examiner's office, which means they'd been autopsied. But it was so mind boggling for me because other than a fractured wrist and bruising on her legs, she didn't have any bruising. I expected to see what I had seen as a child when I thought about the autopsy and knowing that she had died in a motorcycle accident. I expected it to be so much more traumatic to her body, but it wasn't. And I remember leaving that experience thinking, wow, like death really takes on different shapes. I don't know what injury killed her. I think maybe she broke her neck, but I remember being almost confused because the physical signs of her accident weren't there from my perspective.
Mhm.
So those are the two first, as a child and then as a professional. So just to speak a little bit more directly about what I do, I'm the founder of the Multicultural Death and Grief Care Academy. And that academy was founded because through going to mortuary school, I realized that there's not education about specifically how to care for Black bodies. That was my initial concern. Things like your beautiful natural hair, these twists that I have in, braids that someone may pass away with, or any other style that we as African Americans tend to lean towards. That's a big part of our overall appearance, right? And if a funeral director doesn't know how to either recreate, care for, or even prep our hair or do our makeup so a professional can come in behind them and do our hair or touch up our makeup, then how are we returning our loved ones, or how are we returning the decedents to their loved ones? And I share the
Mm.
story.
Whoa, I need to ask a question. Oh my gosh. Whew. This is a lot, and I don't want to interrupt, but I want to make sure we're all following. First of all, how long is mortuary school or
Okay.
mortician school?
It
And
varies.
then, oh, okay, tell us that, and then how you're saying it's a sacred thing to return the person back to their people. Oh my gosh. That's just giving me chills. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And then
It's
everyone here knows
okay.
I had braids. Everyone you've been following the show, you see my hair all kind of ways. You've seen it natural. You've seen me with those long braids hanging down. You've seen me with it straightened. That is what the grave woman is talking about. Everyone's hair does not grow out of their head straight, and it's just easy. But these are the things that I think people take for granted. We just put on a black dress and go to the funeral. So I just thank you. Keep going. I just want to make sure everyone's with us and following and appreciating this for what it is. So thank you.
I appreciate you for stopping me because I get so enthralled and passionate about it. I can just go on and on and on, and I forget that this isn't people's everyday experience. So thank you for that. But to answer your question about mortuary school, you can either get an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. Most programs are associate degree level. For example, I have an associate's degree in funeral service and mortuary science. For me, it took a year to complete mortuary school because I had gone to college before, so I had those prerequisite courses. Had I not gone to college before that, it would have taken about 3 years for me to get through the entire program. And I want to talk a little bit about the program because I don't think a lot of people understand that mortuary school is the equivalent of going to medical school without the specialty context. We take the pathology, the biology, the gross anatomy, the microbiology, the embalming, the accounting, the psychology, sociology, the business classes. I mean, in 11 months, I took 28 classes, college classes. It was not a joke. Um,
Mm.
Getting into mortuary school for many people is more difficult than getting into medical school. And I think that's something that a lot of people do not know or appreciate about funeral directors. And to answer your question, I'm sorry, could you repeat that second part of the question?
Oh, I don't even remember. We'll circle back.
Okay.
Could you tell us about embalming? Like, what does
Sure.
that mean for people? People don't even know what that means. Like, simply, what do you do?
Definitely. So embalming by definition is disinfection, preservation, and restoration to the most natural lifelike appearance of a human body, which is the preservation aspect. So disinfection, um, disinfection, restoration, and preservation. This involves us using the vascular system and embalming fluids in an embalming machine to essentially pump the blood out of the body and replace that blood with a preservative, which is embalming fluid. Now, embalming fluids come in different formulas, different strengths of formaldehyde, depending on what a person has going on intrinsically as well as extrinsically. So, when someone like myself is about to embalm a body, we may ask the family, did this person take certain medications? What did this person pass away from? And we also are looking at those extrinsic factors. Where was this person when they passed away? Were they in a hot environment? Were they inside? Were they outside? Was it humid? Was it not humid? Were there animals around? So many different factors play into the condition of our body when we pass away. And so we take all of those things into consideration to create an embalming fluid solution specific to that individual. I say that to say that it's not a cookie cutter practice. Each and every single embalming is unique, and that requires a high level of um, education in chemistry. So we're chemists as well as death care professionals. And so once that blood has been replaced with embalming fluid, that then leads us into restoring the lifelike appearance. And that is achieved through cosmetics. And that is why, for us at the Multicultural Death and Grief Care Academy, teaching about melanin makeup is essential, because I don't know if yourself or any of your listeners have ever been to a funeral of a person that looks like a ghost. They look white
Mm.
or maybe
Mm.
too dark or
Yeah.
is off. A lot of that has to do with that chemical solution that has been used in those fluids, as well as the embalmer's ability to recreate or restore with cosmetics.
Mm.
And then the final step is presentation, presenting that human who has passed away back to their community and hopefully have them received. One of the most heartbreaking things that can happen for a funeral director or embalmer in particular is for the family not to be pleased with the way that their loved one looks, because we put a lot of time, energy, and skill into that restoration piece.
Mm. That makes me sad for them, you know? That's a really weighty job that you have. Wow. I'm being educated here, and I don't remember, you know, what I wanted to know, but we can get back to some of the courses that you created in your academy so that we have, you know, the culturally competent, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion of care in the death care industry. Tell us when you started your academy.
Definitely. So the academy, I have to give credit to my mentor, Miss Anita Grant. She's known online as the NBE review coach. She found me on YouTube and she reached out to me and said, "Do you know that you could teach about what you talk about on YouTube and not only earn, you know, a living, but also educate other professionals?" So she is the one that encouraged me to really think about some of the gaps that needed to be filled from formal education's lack of inclusivity. And so my background is in cosmetology and barbering. So the first thing I gravitated towards was, okay, they need to learn how to take care of our hair. And so
Um, Back to the story where you mentioned there was a gap in understanding how to take care of different types of hair. You shared this experience at the Death Care Super Conference about being in school and what you witnessed. Could you tell us that real quick, my audience?
yes, definitely. So when I was in mortuary school, we're required to do what's called clinicals, and clinicals involve students going to a local funeral home and watching seasoned professionals care for decedents and families, particularly in the embalming process. And I happened to be the person going to the funeral home that day, and there was a seasoned professional, older white gentleman who had been tasked by the family to remove what's called box braids from a Black woman's hair. And for those that are unfamiliar, box braids are often created through adding extensions to the hair of African American and other women to extend the length of the braids. And so I
Bo
walked.
Derek.
Right, Bo Derek, perfect example. Or for the younger kids, Kim Kardashian braids. But so shady. But to so I basically walked in on this gentleman cutting this woman's braids out from her scalp. So you can see my hair right
Balding
now.
her.
Balding her, like
Scalping
literally
her.
balding her, right. And so luckily, thank God, he started in the back and not the front. And so I'm like freaking out. Oh my God, don't do that. Don't do that. And he's looking at me like I'm a crazy person. And I'm like, you're cutting all of her hair off. Do you not under? And then you could just see the color wash out of his face. He felt horrible. And so, of course, I used that moment to educate him and all of the other people in the prep room about, not cutting out women's braids. And if someone comes in here with braids, you guys don't touch them. You wait until I get here and I'll show you how to do it and make sure that it's done correctly. And that really opened my eyes to the fact that, again, this was a seasoned professional. He was well respected, not only in our workplace, but throughout the industry. And he simply did not know how to care for this Black woman's hair because he never had to before. He'd never been taught to before. And it wasn't even like an industry standard that he should be. And so one of the first courses that I created talked about the history of braids, talked about the spiritual significance of head coverings, because I had heard some very ill-timed remarks about placing head coverings on the deceased, or families coming in shrouded or with head wraps, and because people just didn't understand the cultural significance, the religious significance of those things. And so that first course was entitled Cultural Competency, Black Hair and Skincare for Deathcare Professionals. Around this same time, in the same year, 2020, which is when the academy started, George Floyd was murdered. And I was so upset by seeing not just his murder, but the way his dead body was treated after he was murdered. And so, again, joining forces with my mentor, we created the Racism and Deathcare Parts 1 and 2 course. And that's really the course that put us on the map. I think that was God in the universe saying to us that people really need to know this, and we're going to open the door so that you can let as many people know as possible. And that course literally went international overnight with registrations. And in that course, we talked about the distrust of the African American community that we have with non-Black funeral professionals because of the lack of autonomy we've had over our bodies and the way that our bodies have been basically playthings for the medical communities historically. And so we educate about that. We educate about implicit and explicit bias and just the things that contribute to families having experiences and decedents having experiences that are plainly just rooted in racism within our industry. And we had a very open dialogue with all of our registrants, hundreds who were mostly white women, death doulas, end of life hospice workers and nurses, a few palliative care doctors. And the conversation was so rich that we decided to create part 2. Another course is disenfranchised grief, grieving as a Black person, grieving as someone who's had an abortion, grieving. One of the participants who's now deceased is a classmate of mine. She talked about her best friend who died in a drunk driving accident. She went out drinking with her family for her birthday, got in the car and killed 3 other people. Her family experienced disenfranchised grief because not only did she pass away, but she was responsible for the deaths of other people. So how does that grief look in society? In addition to those courses, we also have technical courses that focus on things like removing braids, shampooing, conditioning, and detangling African American or textured hair. Um, that's important because a big part of the embalming process involves water. And when water comes in contact with our hair, it shrinks and it often tangles if our hair is not chemically treated. And when that happens to a person who doesn't have that cultural reference of shrinkage, it's amazing and hilarious to see what happens to their face. It's like her hair was this long and now it's up here. I don't know what I did wrong. And so educating
That's
people,
so cute.
it is, but it's also sad because
Yeah.
mortuary school, we're taught, you shampoo this person's hair, even if you're not styling their hair, they teach us to prepare it for the stylist that's coming in. But then in the real world, it's like, well, I don't know what to do with their hair. So either the family's gonna have to bring a wig or hire somebody to come in. And that's putting the responsibility of the family or the community to do your job as a professional, which is not okay.
Okay.
And so, yeah, we talk about that, about caring for locks, cleansing locks, not just the technical aspect, but the spiritual reverence for people's hair of different cultures. Because a lot of times, washing of the head, that's something that's done by elders when someone's born. And we can give families and elders that opportunity to do it when someone passes away. Honoring someone's lock journey in the way that you treat their hair in the embalming room. I mentioned the melanin makeup masterclass where we talk about recreating that natural appearance with cosmetics, especially when someone has passed away of a traumatic loss, like an accident, gunshot, stabbing, just any trauma that you can think of. And I will say this to kind of build a bridge with the medical community. I can honestly tell you, I can't say the majority, but a great deal of our clientele or of our students are medical professionals. And so that has encouraged us to start applying for CME credit to be able to offer that to, or certification to be able to offer those credits to medical professionals as well.
That's fantastic. Wow, so much stuff. Since we talked about the specifics of embalming and preparing, the body and giving it back to the loved one, maybe you can help us just touch on a little bit of the things that we covered at the death conference because I didn't know there were legal aspects. I didn't know that there were certain states where you can't, where end of life doulas slash death doulas are being accused of being a funeral director or things like that. No clue. Tell us some of those things.
I'm so excited to talk about that because actually Ashley and I will be presenting together next week about the
Okay.
synergy between death doulas and funeral directors. But yes, there are some states. I don't know. I'm not even going to act like I know which states those are, but there have been lawsuits brought up against death doulas because, and it's a slippery slope, right? On one end, anyone should be able to offer care to someone who's passing away. That's being a human being, right? To be there to
Yeah.
comfort them, talk to their family. And my understanding, that is what a death doula does. Where the line gets blurred is where, at least in my perspective, there becomes the conversation about what I'm going to do to your body after you pass away. And so there have been death doulas that have been sued because they are at the way they advertise their services, and from my understanding sounds like a job that a funeral director would do, or the state having one little word in their law about funeral service that makes a death doula fall under that category. And because they're doing their work as a human being without a license, the state takes action. I don't want to pretend like I know the details because I don't. I will say that I am of the belief that a funeral director is a funeral director, or an embalmer is an embalmer, mortician is a mortician, and a death doula is a death doula. I think there's lots of opportunity for us to work together to better serve our communities, which it should all be rooted in. But when you are dealing with two populations that work so closely in their roles, but not really. And one party is telling the family what they can and can't do. And a family has this belief and comes into the funeral home. And it's like, well, we can't really do that. That's not legal, depending on where they live. The waters get very murky and it becomes a big mess. So yeah, I'll just leave that at that.
Yeah, and it's good. So everyone here, you all know my book, The Real Deal About Hospice, was co-authored with the End of Life Doula slash. Oh, you got it.
I
I
haven't read
forgot
it
you
yet,
bought it.
but I
I
got it. And
forgot.
it's signed.
It's just a reference. So just look it up. Oh, you're so sweet. Yeah, written by her. And, that's a discipline in and of itself. We've had Ashley on, the president of NEDA. We've had Gabby on, she's a nurse up in the Bay Area, the Hospice Heart. And so everyone has a role. So I've seen a little bit of maybe blurring line slash conflict, with a funeral director or a social worker or a nurse in the various groups that I'm a part of. And so I really love how we're being very clear about this discipline and it's different, it's unique, and it's I believe it is a bridge. It's bridging us all together. Ashley's the one who, invited me into this space because of our interactions and her being on here. And I feel like the death doula is the bridge because it's the humanity of these industries, the healthcare and the funeral care and all this stuff. So I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that, but we could move on.
I do. So I think funeral directors get a bad rap because not because of corporations, but because of people's perception of corporations. Corporate funeral homes operate very differently than mom and pop funeral homes, right? And we as funeral directors, again, I talked about that restoration and that embalming process. A big factor in how successful that practice is determined upon time because decomposition sets in, right? And so I think a lot, in my opinion, a lot of the line gets blurred when we are looking at that part of it, the time we want to give your loved one back to you because we care. And yes, we become territorial when we take custody of that individual because we want to present them back to their family in the best way possible.
Mm-hmm.
I also wholeheartedly believe that people deserve to spend as much time with their loved one as they want to when they pass away, regardless of where they pass away. I think it's inhumane for someone to pass away and be snatched away from their community. I just don't think sometimes we as consumers don't understand the back end of things. Again, like what I was saying about the time. And so when you have a person saying to you, these people are bad because they just want your money, that's not okay, because that's an incorrect perception of why we feel the way we feel about our jobs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I know
That's
that's a big
good.
conversation between the Deathcare and the death doula communities. And so we're so excited. I'm excited to talk about that next week at NFDA, the National Funeral Directors Association conference with Ashley.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Everyone look that up. Yeah, and I'll just chime in on the hospice part. The interdisciplinary team were very cognizant of, the family spiritual practices, one sometimes there's a patient, with a Buddhist background with their specific, we need to leave their loved one there for 8 hours, or I don't want to mess it up, but a certain amount of time. And so we respect that. I remember one team, we had, a patient in like, is it a monastery? I don't know. It was where monks are. So I was like so nervous because I don't want to desecrate the experience. And so we are very aware of that. And so I want to encourage everyone here. You guys know I always bring it back to hospice. Tomorrow's World Hospice and Palliative Care Day. But people in the United States don't, take advantage of hospice care, this health care, at the end of life like they should, we help with the final arrangements. That's the extent, like it's in place. So you don't have to be subject to the coroner being called or things like that. Like everything is set up so things go smoothly and your person has that transition to the next phase of death care. And, I just hope that us talking, having this conversation enlightened a few folks and just, help move the needle. So I want to hear about like what you think the impact of your courses have been, your blog, your YouTube, and this course. Like, what have you seen if that little 8-year-old girl could step back and see now?
It's so funny you asked that question because I've been participating in a business accelerator called E for All, and we had to come up with what our social impact is. And I've never thought about that, to be honest with you. I feel like I'm on assignment and I'm doing the work, but I've never really
Amen.
thought about what the impact is. And when I sat down and thought about it, our social impact is number one, it's educating death care professionals about cultural nuance and how to honor individuals and communities of diverse, whatever background, sexuality, orientation, identity, whatever. Um, it is being an advocate and an educator and really empowering death, end of life, doulas, medical professionals to care for anyone that comes into their care, especially in those final moments. Because whether we realize it or not, that's someone's memory for the rest of their life, what those moments look like. And then finally, it is really to empower consumers to say, you know what? I deserve this. I really deserve to care for my loved one. If that means more time, if that means I see them for the last time and their hair looks good, their cosmetics look good, they look like my person. And that is all what I consider to be a level of accountability to our industry. So the impact is that we've raised the bar of accountability for the death care industry.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Um, I don't know. I'm kind of speechless. I have so many curious questions. Maybe we'll have to take this offline. Um, but yeah, any final thoughts about where we're going and how we can just be better working together in human care?
Definitely. I want to say, firstly, thank you. I think the work that you do is an amazing feat and an amazing assignment. So I just appreciate the fact that you're being obedient in your assignment. And I see you and I appreciate you.
Thank
Um,
you.
I also think that conversations help. I said on stage that just because someone's asking you a question and it kind of bruises your ego a little bit or makes you ping on the inside, it doesn't mean that they're trying to be offensive. I think we've lost appreciation for curiosity. And if we're
Mhm.
to improve, we have to allow people to be curious, but we also have to remain curious, which means remaining teachable. And so, yeah, if we do that, I think
Amen.
we'll be good.
Amen. You said that. And I remember, this is one last question that I had. Sometimes when there's a funeral, someone has to have a closed casket.
Mhm.
Is it because, the restoration is impossible, or tell us about that before we sign out and land this plane?
Definitely. Sometimes it's the request of the family. It's not as, deep as though we couldn't fix them or, oh, his head was chopped off. It's sometimes not that deep. It's just sometimes some people have put in their prearrangements that I don't want anyone to see me and I'd appreciate if I had a closed casket. And we honor
Mhm.
that wish. Sometimes the family comes in and says, we just can't see them and we would prefer. Maybe they've had their moment before. They don't want to sit there for 30 minutes while everyone else comes through and views them. It's too much for them. And then other times there are cases where people experience a drastic amount of trauma. And the rule of thumb, not to be too graphic for your audience, but the rule of thumb is that we need 2/3 of bone structure and facial feature in order to recreate that natural lifelike appearance. There are some very, very, very skilled and gifted restorative artists or embalmers that can put someone's face back together with no issues. But then there are circumstances such as maybe burns or various traumas that just don't allow us to do that. And that, I will say, is one of the most, in addition to someone not being pleased with the way their loved one looks, not being able to give that loved one back to their family one last time in that way is very hurtful for death care professionals.
Do you all do that with clay or something, like the 2/3 rule?
We
I don't know.
use
I'm sorry. Is it
there
too
are
much?
mortuary waxes, clays,
Mm.
art, some things you would buy at an art supply store. I mean, when it comes to restorative art, and I almost don't want to answer this question because I don't
Oh,
want to
I'm
be
sorry.
offensive, but it's okay. I can phrase it very well. Creativity is our friend. And I'm not saying that we're putting objects on or in your loved one, but I've seen people do wonderful things with cotton and glue to create
Mm.
a feature, or
Oh,
plastics, hard plastics. So I mean, there are definitely some things. I'm going to tell you what I think would be an amazing business venture. So if there's any entrepreneur out there that is innovative and interested in death care, I think this is like $1 million business, and I'm going to give it away for free. Um, I don't know if you all have seen, I'm sure you have, medical prosthesis, like
yeah.
fingers, hands. There's a gentleman, Black gentleman, I think from Africa, who makes them skin tone, flesh tone for us. I think 3D printing and medical prosthesis coming together would be an amazing thing for funeral homes. But it will be wildly expensive. And the reason it will be wildly expensive, because remember, I told you each embalming is unique. So it won't be something that could be mass produced, but the ability for a funeral director or a restorative artist to program in a 3D printer and be able to print a prosthesis that is unique to that individual to recreate form, and then we build with mortuary waxes and clays and plasters from there, would be a game changer.
It's going to happen because look, we have the facial recognition and all this other stuff. It's going to happen in our lifetime. Let's believe it. Thank you, Grave Woman, for being my guest to wrap up this wonderful season 2 of the podcast. Tomorrow's World Hospice and Palliative Care Day. We're going to live stream, and I'm just so grateful that we were able to talk about the conference. I got to experience you in person. You're so grounded, and I feel so safe with you. Um, and just thank you. So we're gonna sign out. Peace,
Thank you.
everyone.